The Denver Broncos are an organization that's been around since the dawning of the AFL. And during their time, they've had a lot of years where they've been not so good. They've also had some years where they've been really damn good. They've had a couple of crowning achievements and a lot of so close yet so far away disappointments. And you look at the history of this Denver Broncos organization, they've had some great players during their 50 plus years of existence. They don't measure up in terms of overall talent compared to some of the other teams throughout NFL history, that's for sure. But they've had their fair share of great players, no question about it. And it was still a challenge for me to sort through some of the different players and go through and determine who were the five greatest Denver Broncos in organization's history. Now, I had to leave some players off of the list, as is always the case, and some of the notable guys that were left off the list for me are guys like Tombstone Jackson, and you're also talking about maybe a Carl Mecklenburg, definitely talking about a Steve Atwater, guys like Rod Smith, guys like Gary Zimmerman, some of these truly great Broncos players over the years that were good, but just weren't good enough to crack this list ultimately. So the ultimate question again, I guess, is the topic of this video. Who are the five greatest Denver Bronco players of all time? Well, let's find out, in my opinion at least. And again, you're welcome to chime in with your own list of the five greatest Denver Broncos of all time. You are welcome to challenge me on my list or tell me how great and awesome my list is and how great and awesome I truly am. Number five, Floyd Little, the sixth overall pick out of Syracuse in the 1967 NFL-AFL draft. Floyd Little was one of those players that for many years a lot of people argued deserved induction into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Now, while I'm not quite on that same boat or bandwagon as a lot of those people, they finally had their voice heard, and Floyd Little finally got his place as part of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But during his time, there's no doubt he was one of the first truly great Broncos players, a five-time Pro Bowler, a one-time first-team All-Pro, and in some lean years of the Broncos' history of the late 60s and early to mid-70s, he was that star player, that best player in that organization's history during that time. So again, he ultimately earned a place on this list. Number four to me, Randy Gradishar, a 14th overall selection out of Ohio State in the 1974 NFL Draft. During his 10 seasons in Denver, this guy to me became one of the truly great linebackers of his time and a truly underrated and appreciated talent during his time, and a guy that, as much as people want to talk about Floyd Little deserving a spot in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, I think Randy Gradishar is an even bigger snub and an even bigger omission that I frankly don't get. You're talking about a seven-time Pro Bowler as a middle linebacker, a two-time first-team All-Pro, the 1978 NFL Defensive Player of the Year, one of the real key reasons with that Orange Crush defense of the 70s that the Broncos made it to Super Bowl 12 to begin with. It was kind of a magical carpet ride that season. And Randy Gradishar was the star of stars, in my opinion, on that 77 Broncos defense. And I don't understand, again, to this day, you're talking about during a 10-year stretch where he was primarily the best defensive player on that team for pretty much all 10 of his seasons there in Denver. I don't understand why he still hasn't found his place in Canton as a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. I'm assuming it'll come sooner rather than later. At some point in time, a previous wrong will be righted, but he definitely belongs on the list of anybody's list of greatest Denver Broncos of all time, and he cracked my list at number four, and I could make the argument that he maybe goes even one spot higher. But number three to me goes to Champ Bailey, who was a part of that Clinton Portis deal back in 2004. During Champ Bailey's 10 seasons in Denver, you're talking about a guy that made the Pro Bowl 8 times, was a three-time first-team All-Pro. He was a guy that was a part of a team, that made multiple playoff appearances towards the end of his run in Denver. Three straight playoff appearances, as a matter of fact, including an appearance at Super Bowl 48. You talk about a member of the 2000s NFL All-Decade team, and a no doubt about it, Hall of Famer. And when he goes to the Hall of Fame, he will ultimately go in as a Denver Bronco for sure, not as a Washington Redskin. Champ Bailey was one of the truly great defensive backs of his time, perhaps the best man-to-man cover corner of his time, and definitely deserves a spot number three on my list. Now we go to number two, and during those 90s years of the Broncos, where they ended up having some disappointments, but ultimately winning those two Super Bowls in the 97 and 98 seasons, People will talk about Terrell Davis, and it's a shame that a Terrell Davis wasn't able to crack this list for me either, but it just wasn't enough time. There just wasn't enough production, even though someday I hope maybe he finds a way to go into the Pro Football Hall of Fame because during his time he was outstanding. But the number two greatest Denver Bronco of all time, in my opinion, was another player on that offense of the Broncos in the 90s, a tight end that really helped change the game, and that is, of course, Shannon Sharpe. Now, think about this. When he got drafted in 1990 in the seventh round, 192nd overall pick out of Savannah State, most people only knew him in passing, maybe as Sterling Sharpe's brother. You know, but needless to say, he made his own name during his time in the NFL and really helped change the game again in terms of the fact that a tight end didn't have to be 250, 260 pounds in order to enjoy a lot of success there. This guy was an offensive weapon and a consistent target in the passing game throughout the entire decade of the 1990s for John Elway. You're talking about an 8-time Pro Bowler, a 4-time first team All Pro. You're talking about a 2-time Super Bowl champion, the 1990s NFL All Decade team member. You're talking about a guy that set several career records as a tight end throughout his time in Denver. This, to me, was one of the truly great Denver Broncos and one of the truly great draft steals of all time. The 192nd overall pick of the 1990 NFL draft, because people didn't know if he was a big wide receiver or if he was a tight end. All he did was he dominated in the 1990s as a tight end, no question about it. But I think this is easy. The number one greatest Denver Bronco of all time has to be John Elway. You go back to the 1983 draft and how all that played out. They basically acquired him for Chris Hinton in the future. I believe it was first round pick. And all John Elway did was to go on in his 16 seasons to become the Denver Broncos. A 9-time Pro Bowler, a 2-time Super Bowl champion, a 5-time AFC champion, the 1987 NFL Most Valuable Player, a member of the 1990s NFL All Decade team, a Super Bowl MVP, a first ballot Hall of Famer. Let's face it. Let's be realistic. Now, with all the focus in today's Denver Broncos on Peyton Manning, who, if he plays another 2 or 3 years and puts up the great numbers that he's put up in his 2 years in Denver, will definitely end up cranking this list. Let's not kid ourselves here. Peyton Manning in a Denver Broncos uniform is still measured against the GM, the executive vice president, the greatest player in the history of the organization. That is John Elway. You're talking, again, a 9-time Pro Bowler in his 16 seasons. He led some so-so Broncos teams in the 80s to multiple Super Bowl appearances. An NFL MVP, member of the 1990s All-Decade team, Super Bowl MVP, first ballot Hall of Fame. A guy that became synonymous with late game heroics in the fourth quarter comeback. People really started to pay attention to this stat because of people like John Elway and people like Joe Montana. And John Elway sometimes had the most dramatic, spectacular comebacks of them all. Ask Cleveland how that works and how that feels. Beyond question, I think, and it's not even close. John Elway is the greatest Denver Bronco of all time and may always be the greatest Denver Bronco of all time. So again, let me know down below what you think of my list, who you think the 5 greatest Denver Broncos are of all time. And next up, we'll take a look at the Detroit Lions as I continue on throughout this magical journey, looking at every organization's 5 greatest players of all time throughout the month of June.